Hi, everyone. This is John Marciano. I'm the co-head of the Renewable Power Group at Allen and Overy, global law firm. I'm excited here today to be talking with Mr. Bill McKibben and Richard Keiser and Common Energy about a very exciting analysis that Common and Richard have put together that basically takes the emissions goals and some government data that just came out recently and put some real numbers around it to try and come up with what do we actually need to do in order to meet the goals, and is it feasible, and on what timeline. And so without further ado, let me turn it over to Richard and we'll get started with the discussion.
Great. Thanks so much for the warm introduction, John. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for taking the time to join us. I'm very pleased to introduce a man who many of you know, Bill McKibben. Bill has been one of the leading figures in climate change for over 30 years. In 2007, he founded 350.org, naming the organization after the boundary that most scientists consider the safe upper limit for atmospheric carbon dioxide. And through 350.org, he has educated and mobilized millions of people around the world to fight and protect our planet and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Along the way, he's received many prestigious awards, including the Gandhi Peace Prize and honorary degrees from 19 colleges and universities. Bill, we're so happy to have you with us. Please kick us off.
Well, Richard, what a pleasure to be with everybody today. And what a pleasure that we're now finally at the point in this long debate about climate change where we're putting real numbers on things with real deadlines and talking about how to achieve them. You know, I wrote the first book about climate change back in 1989. And the sad truth is we basically knew what we needed to do back then. Not much has changed in the basic underlying science, except that it's all much clearer now that half the ice in the Arctic is gone and we're seeing record wildfires and record numbers of hurricanes and on down the dismal list. What has changed, finally, is that despite the 30-year disinformation effort by the fossil fuel industry, we're reaching a point where the most important institutions on the planet are finally telling us that the time has come to act. So the United Nations in Paris 6 years ago, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which gave us a hard and fast deadline of 2030 to cut our emissions by 45% if we have any hope of meeting those, keeping on that pathway to those Paris targets. And last week, the International Energy Agency, formed by Henry Kissinger of all people in 1974 as a kind of club for the oil consuming countries, long a friend to big oil, now saying that the time has come for an end this year to new development of coal and oil and gas fields. All of that is reverberating now around the world. 2 hours ago, a court in the Netherlands ruled that Royal Dutch Shell, one of the biggest companies on the planet, has to cut its emissions 45% by 2030. As we speak today, Exxon seems to be delaying their shareholder meeting for a final counting of votes to see if climate activists have succeeded in putting board members on their board. And what that means, I think, is that we're kicking and screaming, perhaps, ready to get down to business here. And getting down to business now means not just winning the political and rhetorical battles, it means winning the execution battles going forward. People have thought that this is an insoluble problem, that we can't do it, but over the last decade, engineers and scientists have dropped the cost of renewable energy so quickly that we're now in a position to move much more rapidly than we thought. Whether we're in a position to move rapidly enough to catch up with the physics of climate change is an open question. This is incredibly hard work, but as we're doing the math, we have to show our work. And Richard Keiser and Common Energy are showing some of that work today, and it's interesting work for us all to look at. So Richard, over to you to go through your analysis of how these numbers come together.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Bill. That's a great introduction, and I appreciate your kind words. I'm going to set up the analysis, and then we're going to go through a couple slides quickly, and then begin an open discussion around slide 7. Also, I'd like to remind everyone that the presentation is available for free at commonenergy.us/labs, and you can download it there. It's also being recorded, this presentation, and we're distributing the video after the presentation. So each year, the United States publishes an incredibly useful report. It's called the Annual Inventory of Greenhouse Gas Emissions at SINKS. It's over 500 pages, and the annexes are about 2,000 pages. And what this document does is it quantifies all of the different emissions by economic sector, by activity, and by type. And over the last few years, I've studied this report, and more recently, it became a bit of an obsession of mine, because I believed, rightly, that understanding it held the key to reversing the damage that we are doing with fossil fuels and could provide a roadmap for clear action. The topic of climate change is so vast and encompasses virtually every aspect of human activity, from eating to bathing to simply turning on the lights, that it's extremely difficult to think about all of these different solutions in a coherent way. And that became a goal of mine, to distill all of these thousands of activities that emit greenhouse gas emissions into a simple, understandable framework that could inform leaders and ideally positively impact US policy. So let's jump in. The most important conclusions of the study are summarized here and are the following. Number 1, the vast majority of solutions to the United States climate problem and the pathway to achieving net zero emissions exist today without significant breakthroughs. We will demonstrate this clearly and numerically, and in doing so, present effectively the opposite of what Bill Gates has been saying in public. Respectfully, and as an admirer of his, Mr. Gates knows very little about climate science and climate change, and clearly has not done the math. Number 2, given that we possess the majority of solutions today, and given the urgency of climate change as a world-scale problem, this means the focus of US government policy should be on the speed of deployment. Number 3, within deployment, the cornerstone of US policy must be a dramatic expansion of clean electricity infrastructure, mainly all-scale solar, wind, and offshore wind. This is because every other climate mitigating strategy, electrifying transportation, electrifying heating, electrifying cooking, all of these are dependent on abundant clean electricity. And then finally, number 4, we present here, as you can see, a framework consisting of 6 easy to understand strategies that the United States can use to achieve net zero emissions. So what I'm going to do to start is quickly frame the issue in some key numbers, and then we'll get to a few slides that Bill, John, and I will discuss together. Okay, let's begin. So first, what is zero and what is net zero? Okay, zero means no emissions at all. This is a fully functioning US economy that has been fully decarbonized. Okay, this is impossible today and probably impossible forever. As long as there is just one natural gas plant, one living cow, one person burning wood in a fireplace, then we will have some greenhouse gas emissions. So what net zero is about is a state in which we are sequestering as much carbon emissions as we are emitting. Okay? And this balance can be achieved at a high level of emissions, as shown on the example to the left, and also through a lower level of emissions, as shown on the right. And that's the pathway we're going to show today. The former would be extremely expensive, and the latter a lot less so. So how do we get to net zero? Okay. We get to net zero through a number of steps, and each of them has the effect of decreasing emissions in each respective sector. Okay. And this graph here really summarizes the entire analysis. It's probably the most important graph in the analysis, maybe one other. And so I'm going to go a little bit slowly here. Okay, so the first thing we need to do, which is well known, is we need to decarbonize our electricity infrastructure with wind, solar, and electric storage. Okay. And doing so, we calculate, will reduce emissions by about 1.6 gigatons. Second, we need to electrify transportation, and this will further reduce emissions by about 1.6 gigatons. Next, we need to electrify buildings, which is primarily about electrifying heat, okay? Then there are some changes we need to make, actually some pretty profound changes we need to make in how we make things, becoming more efficient, decreasing waste through circularity to reduce emissions in the commercial sector. Then there are a whole host of wins, some easy, some less easy within other sectors of the economy. And basically, you will then arrive at what I'll call a carbon innovation gap. Okay? These are the emissions that we don't yet know how to solve. For example, zero emission airplanes. We don't have an economically viable or technically viable way of doing that for broad scale commercial travel. And as you can see, and this is a pretty important point, it's quite small relative to the total. It's a little bit less than 30%. So we have about 70 to 80% of the solutions today. The majority of these solutions exist today. And so again, what Bill Gates is saying that we need an innovation miracle is demonstrably wrong. So then what do we need to do it? Well, already today, the United States has some net sinks, about 0.8 gigatons. And these are primarily forests. Okay, forests and trees absorb carbon dioxide generally, which is well known. And so this simply leaves a gap of 1.2 gigatons, and this is where we need to invest in additional sinks to achieve net zero. In showing it this way, it's easy to understand, okay, hey, if we do a great job with these first 4 or 5 things and reduce the carbon innovation gap to 1 gigaton, then we would only need to invest in a small number of sinks. Conversely, if we didn't do a great job and we ended up with a carbon innovation gap of, let's say, 4 gigatons, we would need an additional 3.2 gigatons of sinks, which would involve massive, large-scale carbon capture and storage. Okay. So this is the way that the US can achieve net zero, a pathway similar to this, and there are, of course, some minor variations that are viable. And I hope you'll find this an easy framework for understanding this complex topic. So what we'll do in the remaining slides is just dig in here a little bit more to support some of the supporting numbers and show how all of this works together. Don't worry, there will not be a math exam at the end. Okay, so to get to net zero emissions, the first thing we need to understand is where the emissions come from in the first place, and that's what this simple table shows. Consistent with the prior slide, the US emits approximately 6.6 gigatons of carbon emissions each year. 0.8 of that is absorbed through natural sinks, leaving a net emission of 5.8 gigatons. Okay? And our goal is to reduce this number to net zero. So where should we start? Okay, well, 3/4 of these emissions come from combusting fossil fuels. Okay, so the next logical question would be, all right, well, what are we doing to drive those emissions? Okay, and so this is a very valuable table, again, derived from the EPA's report. Here you see the same 4.9 gigatons from the prior slide, the 74%. And then what you can clearly see is that about 70% of these emissions come from doing 2 things: burning oil in your car and burning coal and natural gas to generate electricity. Okay. And so it's simply a requirement that any progress toward net zero must involve these 2 sectors, because Combusting fossil fuels is 74% of the total, and this is 70% of that. So it's over 50%, just those two. And they're closely related. Because if you electrify transportation, you're going to need a lot more electricity. And if you don't have a clean electricity source, then you're just going to shift the emissions from the transportation sector to the power sector. So you need to decarbonize both urgently and together. And guess what? Both those two and the other aspects of this process both have today known, provable, scalable, non-greenhouse gas emitting solutions. In fact, many of you on this call may be part of the solution already. If you're driving a Tesla or another electric vehicle, if you've installed an electric heat pump or an electric water heater, and if you have an electric stove at home. All of these enable decarbonization. So at this point, I've framed the topic, and what we're going to do together is Bill, John, and I are just going to have a bit of a conversation or dialogue around each slide. And we're going to start with the biggest, which is the transportation sector. John or Bill, would you like to comment at all on dynamics within transportation?
Well, I would. I think that this is one of these places that just demonstrates how on topic we suddenly are. There was a long period of time when people thought that it was going to take forever for electrification to make a significant dent in the use of petroleum as the main driver of our transportation system. But that's changing fast, changing because of electric buses and electric bikes, but changing in raw number terms most powerfully because of the sudden rise of electric cars. Yes, Tesla has been a remarkable story for the last few years, but now the Chinese are producing electric cars in larger numbers, and the move from fringe to center is certainly underlined by the remarkable announcement last week that Ford was taking the F-150, the most successful vehicle in its history, and turning it into the Ford E-150. They announced this morning that they're going to spend $30 billion marketing this thing. They already have 45,000 pre-orders for it in a week, which would be equivalent to something like 1/5 of all the EVs sold in the US last year. That's pretty astonishing. And I think what it shows is that cascades come, that there become moments when math goes exponential and we get dramatic kind of phase shifts in things. And we may be on the edge of one of those. We almost certainly are on the edge of one of those with transportation fuels. If you have any doubt whether the message is getting heard, 5 minutes ago, Exxon shareholders elected 2 activist members to their board over Exxon's strenuous objections, demanding that Exxon, world's biggest supplier of transportation fuels, come up with a new plan for how they're going to make money going forward.
That's really interesting.
And I think one of the things that's interesting about this chart is just how striking it is that the scale of the passenger cars and the light duty trucks in terms of, just real numbers relative to even, slightly bigger trucks or airplanes and ships and the like. It's, if you just solved one thing, it would be the passenger and light truck scenario.
Exactly. And using published data, it's pretty easy to determine how much electricity we need to electrify this. On average, a good number is around 4 kilowatt hours a mile. And so what we've done here is taken the latest miles driven data from the Department of Transportation, assumed 0 efficiencies, assumed everybody still drives exactly the same amount, and then calculated how much electricity would be needed to do those same routes. And it's around 900 billion kilowatt hours, which is roughly an increase of 22 or 23% versus current. I think it's remarkable as well that we have so many other examples. The fleet of different electric vehicles is growing, and their penetration into mid and heavy trucks. And so the combination of autonomous and electric will be a powerful driver of reductions here. This next slide was one of the, I don't know if it's an overstatement, but a minor intellectual breakthrough in thinking about this when I was doing the analysis. Of course, I understood that electrifying transportation would have a calculatable impact on the power sector and the need for additional electricity. But then I realized, wait a minute, this also means that every electric car will have a battery. And those sizes range between 75 kilowatt hours and up to 150 plus kilowatt hours. And that would mean a whole lot of storage. And in fact, I calculated at over 17 terawatt hours of storage, or approximately 17 terawatt hours. And that is the entire electrical load for a full day. Okay. And this is simply too much storage to be not connected to the grid. It's vastly important that vehicle-to-grid technology, which Tesla and Volkswagen have recently announced, it's vastly important that those vehicles be able to connect to the grid to help balance renewables. And if so, they provide more than enough storage capacity to take care of or dramatically reduce the single greatest problem with a high renewable penetration grid, which is the variation.
If I can just add, Richard, it's very true in the biggest meta level about the kind of biggest battery in the world. It's going to be everybody's car plugged into their garage. It's also going to be, I think, and this has been sort of overlooked till now, the big sales point for getting this stuff out into people's lives. I've spent my whole life living in rural America. And let me tell you, everybody instantly figured out when they watched that Ford F-150 demonstration that they could plug their house into this when the power goes out, like it did in Texas for 3 days, and keep running things. Everybody who works on a job site is going to quickly understand that really what their pickup truck is now is just a big battery on wheels to run every piece of equipment that they need. So this is, game-changing in that sense, and also in a kind of psychological sense about how we start to think about energy and storage and transportation.
Agreed.
That's exactly right. And I mean, one of the things that's really interesting is everyone's talking about these large-scale standalone storage projects that are tied to the utility grid to try and manage all the intermittent power generation with solar and wind. And really, where we've been going as a country is really toward distributed generation. Yes, we are building new large-scale utility projects, but the more distributed the generation, the less you need to actually make grid improvements. And if we have these vehicles all electrified and they're acting as storage on a distributed basis, it has an exponential effect.
Yeah, it's profoundly important. And I think from a policy perspective, this is an area where the government could step in and basically guide that all electric vehicles must have this capability. And we'd have to, they must be kind of grid ready. That would have to be defined further, but it's too important to simply not connect this amount of storage. Okay, just an administrative note. If we go over, I see that the queue of Q&A is building. We will stay on the line to make sure all questions are answered. We want to involve everybody who's been patient on the line as well. We're just going to go through a few more slides until we get there. Okay, so this is the transportation sector. Let's move on to the building sector. Bill, when we talked about this offline, you had some important comments. Would you like to share?
Yeah, buildings are, again, one of these things that we're just so used to thinking about how they operate now that it's hard for us to imagine how quickly and easily they could be transformed. We now have better technology to replace the fact that people have a big open flame in their kitchen that not only is causing climate change, but also producing asthma, the equivalent of having a cigarette smoker in the house. We have electric heat pumps, so induction cooktops. We have electric heat pumps that will do the job that your oil or gas boiler is doing now. And just to say, the fossil fuel industry realizes how disruptive these changes are. It's why the gas companies are fighting so hard against the increasing number of towns and cities that are mandating new construction be without a gas line into the building and instead use this electric technology. A real key place to watch is going to be there in the city of New York over the next few years. At the moment, there's a really groundbreaking law that will force first big buildings and then smaller buildings to start retrofitting to take advantage of these new technologies. It's the classic example of something that once you do it, saves you money. The Empire State Building was the kind of poster child for this. In a 2-year makeover, it became 40% more efficient without affecting anyone's life in any way, except that the landlord has a lot smaller electric bill and a lot smaller energy bill than they used to. So this is really doable if we get our minds around it, and really important. The numbers add up fast.
Yeah, the volume of heat pumps, electric heat pumps in that market is going to dramatically accelerate over the next few years, because virtually every, well, of course we have electric heat in some buildings, but it's very low penetration. And that market is, we have at this point about 133 million households in the United States. And the vast majority of them are powered by fossil fuels. So electrifying this sector is going to require at least another petawatt hour of electricity. And now I hope folks can start to appreciate these electricity needs are starting to add up. I'd also like to just thank my friend and brilliant engineer, Paul Martin, who actually helped me with these calculations, which I found quite complex. Thank you very much, Paul.
Richard, are there baby steps that you might see happening where maybe we go away from fuel oil first, or we go away from coal for houses first, and move sort of baby steps along the way to electrification? Yeah,
it's a great question. The challenge is that it's much easier to do electrification in a house than it is in a 80-story building that has a very advanced HVAC system. And so figuring out how to do that is going to be quite expensive, and the retrofit process could be quite long. Okay, but the households can be, if you can kind of imagine a household makeover, that can actually take place relatively quickly.
Got it.
Okay, great. Now let's shift to really the big kahuna here, which is the power sector. This, with transportation, again, accounts for 70% of fossil fuel emissions. And today, about 2/3 of carbon emissions come from two sources, natural gas and coal. This is well understood. Now, John, you're one of the most active people in the country in financing renewable energy, new renewable energy projects. And I wonder if you could speak about some of the trends you're seeing and the deals you're doing.
Yeah, I mean, when we started doing solar, wind was bigger and solar was a niche market, and fuel cells were then next. And what we're seeing now is solar is cheaper than almost any other source, even without the tax goodies that are available. One of the reasons that makes the United States have to have some tax benefits is partially that the items that go into the systems are the prices and cost are propped up with tariffs. But we're seeing solar getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. We're seeing people get more interested in going solar. Wind is becoming more efficient, and the projects are getting bigger. We're seeing more and more fuel cells with technology that's viable. Now, a lot of the fuel cells that we see today are natural gas powered, and so there would need to be some conversion to hydrogen. But most of the technologies that we use today with gas can also operate with hydrogen. And then we're seeing a rise in biomass projects, and not the typical you're cutting down trees to burn type biomass, but more we're taking the manure from various animals, pulling out the gas and using that for renewable gas, whether it's natural gas or power.
Great.
And that's an important distinction to make. Cutting down trees or using wood is properly put up there in the fossil fuel sector. It's small now, but you know, it's for a series of bad reasons, it's counted under some laws as carbon neutral fuel source. And so it's expanding in places like England, using lots and lots of pellets shipped over from the forests of the Southeast. And it would be really a good idea to put the kibosh on that sooner rather than later before it gets any more out of control.
Absolutely. You know,
I guess I should.
Go ahead, John.
I was just going to say, I guess I should also note that we're seeing a rise in interest in carbon sequestration projects, not the direct air type, but more looking at emission sources and trying to capture at the emission source.
Got it. Yeah, I think the progress in wind, you know, there was a big announcement yesterday that California was opening up some of its coastline for offshore wind. And I know there are some journalists on the line. The progress in wind has been nothing short of astounding. What is happening with wind, in particular offshore wind, is now the mast heights are so tall that they're actually the turbines are reaching a different portion of the jet stream, which is far more powerful. And so what you're seeing is capacity factors for wind generation, which were previously in kind of the 35 to 40 range, now approaching 65% capacity factor for these new GE turbines, which is just remarkable. And so much so that the United States, NREL, recently revised its wind resource map, effectively doubling or tripling their estimate of how much wind power was available in this country. And so these turbines are a game changer, and that's why the projects that I think you're going to see a lot more offshore wind.
We're seeing it for sure.
Okay, great. Well, let's put these things together because it's a pretty important conclusion. So this is where we are today. This is effectively the exact same data you just saw on the prior slide. Today, the US grid generates around 4.1 petawatt hours. Don't get hung up in the math. That's just a lot of zeros. It's 15 of them. 4.1 petawatt hours, and 2/3 of that comes from fossil fuel generation. So obviously, in the future, we need to replace that fossil fuel generation with clean sources, wind, solar primarily, and depending on where US policy comes out, there could be some more nuclear, but it should be primarily wind and solar. Okay, but then these other pieces we've been talking about, electrifying heating and cooking will increase demand of electricity by another petawatt hour, and transportation around the same amount. Okay, and so the new future US electrical grid needs to be at least 50% larger than today. And these new clean sources are greater than the entire infrastructure of electricity in this country. Okay? And that is an astounding realization. Okay? Basically, every operational power plant in the United States, the equivalent thereof, needs to be built again, okay, to power a decarbonized, electrified world. Okay, and then you can in turn calculate how much clean sources that will require, and this drives home really the point where I started about U.S. climate strategy and net zero strategy. It is critically important that clean electricity and clean electricity infrastructure be the centerpiece of U.S. strategy. Okay? There is no other way to reach net zero emissions without a massive expansion of clean electricity, because all of the other strategies are dependent on abundant clean electricity. Okay, we're almost done with slides and we'll get to Q&A. I thought this is a very important conclusion. You can then quickly calculate, sorry for all the numbers, I'll make it simple in a second. You can calculate how much wind and solar that would take. So here I'm just showing different mix scenarios. So 25% wind, 75% solar, 100% wind, 0% solar, and then here a couple overbuild solutions. So you can frame out that we're probably going to need, I say 2 to 5, probably 3 to 4 terawatts of new renewable energy infrastructure. And today we have about 230 gigawatts. Okay, so this is somewhere between 10 and 20 times what we currently have, and will at least cost $3 trillion. The good news is the US historically has no problem burning, by Joseph Stiglitz, an estimated $2 trillion on wars. So we easily have the ability to finance this. So this is the spending that's going to need to take place in the power sector, and this is going to be going on a long time. This is going to be a 10 to 20 year electricity boom for infrastructure. Let's wrap up the power sector and just talking about the grid. Okay, so how is the grid going to handle all of this additional renewables and all of these additional intermittent sources? Okay, well, there are a number of strategies that can be used to reduce the impact of the variation and therefore smooth the ability to increase the penetration. The first is the US electrical grid needs to be interconnected in a very different way than it is today. Okay? One of the main reasons why Texas effectively shut down is that the ERCOT section of the grid is effectively an island, isolated, isn't able to bleed electricity or import huge amounts of electricity that easily. And that system was easily overwhelmed with the cold front that came through. Okay, so by expanding the interconnections, you can increase the network's ability to absorb variation. I like to give this analogy of a basketball. If you throw a basketball into an aquarium, versus the Atlantic Ocean, where do you get a bigger perturbation? Okay, like the aquarium, right? So the more you connect the network, the greater you expand the network, the higher its ability to deal with perturbations. Okay, so that's going to be important, and there may be an opportunity to connect with Canada as well. This other topic we spoke about, which is electrifying the transportation sector and connecting those vehicles. Okay, that's critically important, vehicle to grid technology. Obviously, there's going to be some nodes in the grid that will need additional storage, whether that's gravitational or electric battery. Overbuilding renewables is actually a pretty good option, and in some cases a cheaper option than storage, particularly hydrogen-based storage. Okay? And so as these costs continue to fall, it may make sense to simply overbuild the renewables and bleed either A, into the network or to ground to, again, smooth out the variation. Finally, some fossil fuel generation is going to need to be maintained, okay? Because there are going to be periods, 10-day periods where just either no wind, no rain, no sun, and guess what? If we get to this point, we've already won. Having backup capacity, when natural gas is relegated to backup capacity, then we've done a lot of things right. And then finally, expanding nuclear power is an option technically. Okay? It has zero greenhouse gas emissions. Politically and operationally, it hasn't been successful. That's why there have been very, very few new nuclear facilities in this country, but it does need to be on the list. It is a technical viable option. Okay, and then finally, just to wrap this up, those in the field are hearing a lot of hydrogen buzz lately, and I'd really like to puncture that balloon, and apologies, it goes over the wrong way. Hydrogen as my friend Paul Martin would say, it's an amazing and useful molecule. Okay? It's terrible as a fuel source. Okay? Creating clean hydrogen, A, does not exist today. It's only about 5%. And B, when you use clean electricity to create clean hydrogen, you have such great energy losses that it makes no sense whatsoever. Okay? And so why are you hearing all of this buzz around clean hydrogen? Well, hydrogen is made today mostly with natural gas. Okay, that's how you get the H's, okay, from the CH4. Okay, if you remember chemistry class. Okay, and so if you have $1 trillion of natural gas resources on your books, and there's the potential, given what the EIA said, that we should stop building natural gas plants and that value could go to zero, then you need another story quick. And that story is hydrogen. And so that's what's behind the hydrogen hype. And so clean hydrogen does have an important role in chemical processes in the industrial sector. But from an economic perspective, it shouldn't be used as a fuel. And that's why we've omitted it from this whole section of electrifying transportation and the power sector. Bill, you know a fair amount about this. And do you have anything you'd like to add here? Whoops, we got you on mute, Bill.
Sorry. I actually know less about hydrogen than I should, partly because I've never thought that it's going to be the way we dig ourselves out of here. It's pretty clear to me that most of the action, all the action that really matters is going to be around electricity, and it's mostly going to come from the sun and the wind. I think what people are just figuring out finally is that the basic job on Earth right now is fairly simple. Stop setting things on fire and start relying on the very large fire that burns 90 million miles away. And I mean, it's really not, around the edges, things get more complicated, but around the edges is not where we are. As this presentation makes clear, if we're going to deal with climate in the time that we have, it's the gross measures that are really the things that are going to matter. And that's all the action is going to be straight down the line for a while with sun, wind, electricity.
Yeah, I love the saying. I'm a huge fan of nuclear energy. It's called the sun. It's 100 million miles away. It provides the Earth with more than 7,000 times annual energy consumption. John, do you have anything to add on the hydrogen story? I know you see that these days.
I think it's a good stopgap, honestly. I mean, there are places where it has a use today. Places like ERCOT, like you mentioned, where there's often nothing to do with the electricity you're generating. You can't get it to market or the pricing is negative. Making hydrogen is a viable outcome in that circumstance. Using it to prop up the price of power is potentially a viable circumstance. And then we know that the DOE has a really strong push to make ammonia, and hydrogen is an input to that. So having hydrogen as finding ways to get it so that you can put it into the ammonia processing is helpful in their eyes.
Yeah, it absolutely has a role in ammonia production. If we don't have ammonia for fertilizer, half of us will die at present, at least.
Right.
So agree with you there.
And it is worth noting that there are a few places on the Earth, Korea, Japan, things where it's difficult to figure out how you get as much renewable sources as you have in most of the world. And there are going to be places where niche technologies literally find a niche. That's why they're niche technologies.
Yeah. Great. Okay, well, we're almost done, and I see Q&A building, so we're going to just accelerate here. And again, I'm happy to stay on a few more minutes to answer, as long as it takes, actually, answer any questions. The second part of the analysis, we're just going to zip through. Basically, part one, we talked about all the first stuff, the big stuff, 74% Part two is all of this other stuff. And there are a series of solutions that exist within this sector as well. We're not going to walk through them today. They're in the full report. One thing that is important to note is if you look at the industrial sector, again, talking about this carbon innovation gap, here, there's a whole lot of stuff that we don't yet know how to do with zero emissions. Okay, and so another component of US policy needs to be really mapping out what these production chains are, these supply chains are, and reimagining how we make things. Fortunately, this is a relatively small part of the equation, okay? Less than, again, 30%. But it's important that we can't give up on these. We have to really rethink how we make them. Okay, so if you were to just do some mental math and add all these things up, as we just discussed, you would have seen the 1.6 from each one of these respective sectors, as we talked about before. That results in this carbon innovation gap. And very fortunately, so then we understand we have to increase the sinks. Very fortunately, the World Resource Institute published a very valuable report estimating the US potential for sinks. And these include direct energy capture and tree restoration. And this is going to have to be tapped into to make up this innovation gap, while it effectively buys us time to figure out all this other stuff. So some combination of direct air capture and CCS, carbon capture and storage, will need to be part of the equation. And once you add these things together and tack those on, your existing sinks today give you 0.8 gigatons, and then the combination of new sinks is how we get to net zero. Okay, so these are the 6 strategies. We talked through each of them. In summary, massively expand clean electricity, electrify everything you can, transportation, heating, and cooking, promote a sharing economy that's more efficient and circularity to decrease waste. Okay, so we're not making stuff that we throw out immediately. Implement known greenhouse gas solutions in agriculture, in particular around beef and cattle. There needs to be some degree of mitigation and substitution for plant-based solutions. Invest in R&D where we don't know how to, where we don't have the solutions yet, and then expand the sinks for anything that we can't do to buy us time. And that's basically it. So this is our contact information. Haley is handling all press requests on the common side and can direct anything for John as well. And then John and my direct number is here. Again, John is involved in large-scale renewable deals across the country, and Alan Overy operates internationally. So they're involved in a large percentage of all US renewable deals. So with that, Lucy or John, who's going to moderate the questions? Is that going to be you, John?
Sure, I'll go through.
Okay.
So Richard, one of the things that maybe teeing off the last thing that Bill mentioned, one of the questions is, by framing this as a US net zero, aren't you missing the carbon emissions embedded in imported goods and services? How do you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely right. One of the reasons why China is the largest emitter on Earth is because we've shifted all of our production over to them. So that's an important point. But just to give you a simple answer, the framework here was really focused on what the US does domestically. And so we don't have great visibility into all of the emission chains for what is imported. So that was excluded.
Great. And so the next one is, how is geothermal a driver for fossil fuel combustion emissions?
It's not usually. Was it classified wrongly on one of the
slides? It looked like it was on slide 7.
Oh, okay. That was probably a mistake, or it might have been related to I'm not sure. It should not be. That might have been a mistake. I apologize.
Sure. And I think you went over this in the main slides, but what exactly is in the sync database? What do you classify? Could you just give us, a swath of examples of what sinks might be?
Yeah, sure. So they're defined in the report. There are lots of different types of sinks, but primarily, a tree absorbs, has an absorption curve over time. Every tree has a lower absorption curve in the first kind of 10 years and then higher during the latter years of its life. So that's why mature forests are so valuable. And so it's primarily trees and primarily fields. Plant phytomass of all types absorbs a certain amount of CO2, and that's what the sinks are.
Could I just add here, I just wanted to add, John, that is such an important point about and it's relatively new science, that trees absorb more carbon the older they get. The rate at which they absorb goes up with each succeeding quarter century. Just a shout out to all the people who are sitting in today trying to block the destruction of old growth forests in Canada and the west coast of Canada today, because not only is it disgusting for a lot of other reasons, but bringing down those last huge old trees is almost literally the stupidest thing we could be doing on planet Earth right now.
Makes sense, Bill. Richard, have you done this analysis globally, or this is the starting point based on the US data?
Yeah, very unfortunately, I have a different day job these days, which is running comp, which takes up a lot of my time. This became a bit of an obsession. I wouldn't have done it if the election had not provided some reasonable possibility that it could be actionable. And so the global data is obviously far messier, okay? But the solutions are going to be very similar, okay? It's just going to vary which one is greater or less, depending on where you are. With China, obviously the power sector is a complete disaster, right? There's so much coal, right? And then transportation relative per capita would be less because, just the availability of cars is totally different. But the conclusions are broadly going to be the same. It's just going to be the magnitude.
And if people want to see a first cut of that for other countries, check out Mark Jacobson's work from his lab at Stanford.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm so glad you brought that up, Bill. Mark Jacobson published last week an article in The Hill stating almost exactly some of the things that we're talking about today, but without putting the numbers behind them. The title of the article was something like 95% of climate emissions, solutions exist today without significant breakthroughs. And he also didn't mince words with respect to John Kerry's interview, who I believe was heavily influenced by Gates, and also by Gates's comments around a climate miracle, which is clearly not what we need.
Richard, do you have a sense of what the climate miracle is that Mr. Gates is talking about?
Yeah, it's related to the industrial processes. And there he's entirely right. Okay, we don't know how to do a lot of these things without having a carbon emission. The problem is, the reason why he's wrong is that he doesn't understand that that's only 25 to 30% of the problem, that the other pieces of the problem, solar, wind, electric vehicles, electric stoves, heating pumps, are the primary drivers. And so he has the emphasis on the wrong area.
And that's part of the reason that we're looking at net zero rather than zero.
Exactly.
Can you just give a little bit of background on what vehicle to grid might be?
Yeah, so this is still very early days and still being defined. The idea effectively is you've got a battery on your car, and that will have a charge at some time. Most people do not drive 200 to 400 miles a day, and so there is a latent range, a certain amount of storage capacity that is going to be live and available and unused in a huge portion of these vehicles. And so the tricky part is how to tap into that dynamically without depleting the car's battery so that when the person wants to drive, they actually can't go anywhere. So this is is a non-trivial technical problem. Okay? It doesn't require a breakthrough or a miracle to solve. It requires very good software and some good control protocols. But that's something like what it would look like. You would need to be able to tap into it not just during the evening, but also during the day. And so it does imply there would be some place to plug in vehicles while they were parked.
Got it. So the next one is, you haven't talked about policy drivers to make this transition happen. What do you think are the key policy drivers, and how likely are they to be put in place?
Yeah, this is a great question. I'm actually pretty optimistic about what is happening right now, not from the political discussions, but the team that's been assembled within the U.S. to work on this is very qualified. Okay? And you've seen more progress on offshore wind in particular, which is absolutely has to be part of the solution, than we have in 50 years in the last 3 months. Okay, but the three key things, speaking back to the two drivers of this, the three key things are: number one, you've got to find a way to accelerate permitting for large-scale renewables, to unblock the ability to get permits. Number two, you have to accelerate the ability to get interconnection into the grid. The utilities that, John, you and I work with on a daily basis have found many, many ways to make that process extremely lengthy. And we just don't have time to mess around. So, and it's difficult to understand the policy framework for making that happen because these are state regulated utilities. And so that needs a lot of thought. And then the third, of course, we touched on, which was making it a requirement for vehicle to grid technology, because even though that's going to take some time to figure out and some time for it to be operational at scale, it's just, again, it's too much storage to just leave dormant, unconnected.
So there's a comment / question, and it relates to the comment that you made earlier, Richard, that we don't know how to decarbonize much of the industry. And the person says, the problem is that people have a burner box on their heads. They think the only way to make industrial heat is by burning stuff. So I think your innovation gap is smaller than you imagine, though I also think that the decarbonization of transport will require biofuels to do heavy lifting. Any thoughts?
Yeah. Clearly, we have a knowledgeable question asker and there. Yeah, I didn't go into it here. In the longer report, which is maybe about twice as many slides, we spend a little bit more time on this. The gentleman or woman who has asked the question will be aware, of course, that in the industrial sector, you also have massive footprint from heat generation and electric arc furnaces and induction furnaces, and there are a whole host of electric technologies that work at scale and could replace those coal furnaces and natural gas furnaces in the same way that we're talking about electric heat pumps in the residential sector. So I agree there 100%. With biofuels, it's a little bit tricky, right? Because if you have a theoretically 100% efficient process, you would then end up with something that would be carbon neutral, but nothing is 100% efficient. And so in general, biofuels will also be carbon emitting, even though the footprint could be less. And second, often they crowd out agriculture in the land needed to make it, in particular food. So it's a little bit tricky. And again, I think there will be a continued role for biofuels, just as Bill said. There's going to be a mix of solutions, but I think it's going to be mostly niche.
Do you think that there's an argument to be made that thermal storage is maybe better than chemical storage in some ways? And do you think that thermal storage will have a place?
Could be. Yeah, it'll all depend on its availability. Any natural resource, the economics are derived from its abundance. This is the reason why Denmark has so many wind farms and other parts that are less windy don't. So if you've got there could be many cases where thermal storage or gravitational storage are better solutions than electric. Absolutely.
Right. What are your suggestions to change the psychology of denial that will be the big barrier to climate change?
Wow. Bill, you want to take that one?
Say it again.
So I think the question is saying there are a lot of climate deniers out there. How do we combat the psychology that's developed denying climate change as a thing?
Climate deniers aren't the problem they once were. The polling makes clear that 70% of Americans now understand that we face a real problem. And that's a combination of great work by activists and Mother Nature hitting us upside the head over and over again with one flood or fire after another. The problem now is just getting more of that 70% actually actively engaged in this work. But that's happening. Young people in particular have taken up this mantle. And truthfully, all of that new changed, what's changing is the zeitgeist. And that zeitgeist is reflected very powerfully now every day in things like that Dutch court ruling about Shell, that vote at Exxon today. Turns out that Chevron shareholders voted an hour ago to cut scope 3 emissions from the company's products, the emissions that come from burning the oil and gas that they sell. So the question is just how you overcome the enormous political power of the legacy industry here. It basically owns one of our political parties right now, and that's a huge problem to overcome. But you do it by organizing, and so that remains. If you're not a great solar engineer who knows how to keep making solar panels more efficient, some of the best use of your time may be joining in all the groups that are pushing hard for to change our laws.
Yeah, I think that's right. And Bill probably knows more about organizing and changing people's minds more than anybody in the country. I think it's also important, John, to note that the best way to change somebody's mind is give them an economic stake in that new kind of future, right? And so the oil and gas companies have deep expertise in mining. And if carbon capture and storage is going to be a thing, which it certainly is going to be, they should have very transferable skills into that area. And so obviously it's going to be a difficult transition, but telling somebody they can't make money from their livelihood usually doesn't work. You got to give them a new toy to focus on.
Right. One of the things we didn't spend a lot of time on was efficiency. Do you think there's a role for efficiency in closing the gap, or was that sort of a simplifying assumption that you made just to keep the ball rolling for the presentation?
Yeah, in the broader presentation, I capture that within the industrial sector, and I think it's an extremely important point. And you might have noticed how I framed the transportation changes. If you looked at that slide, I actually assumed a dramatic decrease in the number of vehicles to get to the 17 petawatt hour number, terawatt number. But I didn't change the miles driven. Okay, if you look at a typical rideshare car, it might have a utilization of 60 to 80%, whereas a typical person only drives, an hour a day, which is 4%. Okay, and so if you have a higher penetration of roadshare vehicles and things like Zoox, which to me is one of the great Amazon acquisitions, fully autonomous, fully electric, a vast majority of deliveries are going to take place this way in the future. You're going to have far, far less things to make, which will dramatically reduce the emissions in the industrial sector. So getting back to a question that was two before this, I do think that I'm being a little bit conservative with that innovation gap, and it could be quite lower already. It might only be 15 to 20% right now.
What do you think the role rural America has to play in this process?
I think it's a similar role to everyone. In fact, if you're in rural America, you probably have a single family home, and it's probably easier for you to change things than if you are in an apartment building in New York City and you don't have control over or easy control over your heat. So I think that that each person and household has their own unique carbon footprint based on their habits and preferences and their infrastructure. And so I think there's a role for everyone to play.
I think, well, Mr. Gates has the largest holdings of farmland in the US, so maybe he has a role.
Yeah, I don't know why he's not putting more wind on it.
Maybe that's the plan. So let's see, does greenhouse gas release when building this net zero infrastructure? Not sure what that question is getting at. Should people get compensation for allowing the use of their EV battery?
I think they should. If they paid for the car and it has the battery, then they own that as well. So I think that's perfectly
There are
reasonable.
examples of this happening already. Where I live here in Vermont, Green Mountain Power is helping people pay for the cost of acquiring the Tesla Powerwall in return for being able to use it on the grid at the moments of peak demand, and they've managed to cut their peak considerably, which of course for utility is a key to reducing costs.
Right. I think as we build out the charging network across America, it'll be interesting to see what happens if you park at the grocery store and all the spots have inductive charging. Can it go backwards effectively when you're just sitting, when you're inside the store? And would you get paid to park your car there effectively? Potentially.
Yeah, I think it's a really important idea, and I do think that you should.
And Richard, we're going to have the report on your website and the slides as well, right?
Yeah, the slides are available now on the commonenergy.us/labs.
Okay.
So it should be available. Just provide your email and it will be sent to you.
Right. Let's see, this question says, so far most of the heat and CO2 have been sequestered in the oceans. Shouldn't we focus on the ocean, especially on ways to permanently sequester the CO2?
This is a fascinating question, okay? The challenge is, and I don't know if you know these numbers off the top of your head, Bill, I do not. The challenge is you still face a very similar problem as what you have in in atmospheric carbon capture, right? So you're with atmospheric carbon capture, you're at 420 parts per million, right? So you're looking around for 0.4 parts per thousand, right? So, or 4 parts every 10,000. So you're hunting a lot for that tiny little molecule, right? And that's extremely expensive. And the questioner is absolutely right that the feedback cycle between the atmosphere and the ocean results in vast uptake of carbon dioxide into the ocean, which is as well understood causing acidification. The sequestering and the cost to do it in the ocean, just to find that same molecule, is probably just as hard and just as expensive. Okay, you just don't need to bring it back down to earth. And so that's the challenge. Could you have large filters there? Yes, absolutely, just like Climeworks is doing. But it is extremely expensive from an energy perspective to capture stuff after it's emitted. About 10 times more expensive than just not emitting it in the first place. This is a very good question.
Do we think we have enough lithium and other related elements in order to build the storage that we think we need?
I don't have a great answer to that question. It's debated. Bill, you want to go ahead?
The really good folks at Carbon Tracker Initiative in London put out a report 2 weeks ago saying we've got plenty of lithium and other minerals available. The problem is, and it's a real problem, that a lot of them at the moment anyway come from places we don't want them to come from. And there are it can be extraordinary human rights violations along this supply chain that we have got to work really hard to scrub out, because it's not okay to, have forced labor supplying clean energy. It makes it dirty in a different way.
There was a comment that I think was answering one of the questions that I passed on, and it says, the question was likely, don't the embodied emissions of building out this new net zero future cancel out the benefits in terms of greenhouse gas emissions? And the person says, the answer is clearly no. All the tech talked about pays back its embodied emissions rather rapidly, and then keeps providing benefits over its life.
Yeah, that's right. But in the early years, it's clearly, yes, they do offset. And like, if you're doing it right, it's kind of a paradox. If you're actually doing this right, we should see a massive increase in emissions associated with an overbuild to get to this new state. But as Bill was nodding his head, like, all activities have a payback period. And now we're talking about a carbon payback period, which should be relatively short.
Well, and the further you get down, the further you get down, I mean, before too long, we're going to be building solar panels with solar generated electricity. I mean, the further you get down this, the better it gets.
Exactly. That's right. That's right.
Richard, does your $3 trillion estimate for the cost of new power capacity include storage and transmission?
No, doesn't include grid upgrades. That'll be additional for sure. I mean, it's really an astounding conclusion that we have to build as much as we have today. The 200-year history of the US power grid needs to be rebuilt extremely quickly. That's a massive undertaking. This is the reason why I answered your policy question the way I did around permitting and interconnection. Those are the bottlenecks.
And then there's a question about nuclear. We didn't really talk a lot about nuclear. How do you guys think nuclear fits into this? Is there likely to be no new substantial builds in the nuclear front?
Bill, do you want to go first? I've got.
Look, first thing is, when you can safely do it, keep the ones you've got now operating, because they're paid for, at least to some degree.
Yeah.
Nuclear comes with obvious risks, but they're different. I mean, if something goes wrong at a nuclear power plant, it can cause a lot of trouble. If you operate a gas-fired power plant exactly according to spec, it destroys the world. So, it's worth bearing that in mind. I doubt that nuclear is going to play a huge role just because of the economics of it. The cost of sun and wind have dropped an order of magnitude in the last decade, but the cost of nuclear power keeps going up. People that are smart, that I admire, Jim Hansen, chief among them, say that there may at some point be a new generation of small, cheap, safe nuclear reactors. And if that happens, then clearly, one will reappraise. But over the coming decade, which is the period of time that the scientists have given us to essentially decarbonize the electric power grid, it seems to me unlikely that it's going to play a huge role. The kind of nuclear power plants we build at the moment, you start building them now, you're not going to be done in a decade. So,
yeah. So we see the giant ones today, the $8 to $15 billion ones, but there's nuclear power plants on submarines and battleships. You guys have a view on why we don't see those deployed commercially?
Check out the Pentagon budget, and then you get some idea of why things are affordable in different spheres.
I'll just tack on to what Bill said. It was with very mixed feelings that, Indian Point in New York City was just recently turned off. And many on the line may know, New York City runs on nuclear, about 35% nuclear power into Con Ed, where I am. And so you think about it, okay, that's good for safety, I guess. It's actually really bad for the environment because it's going to be all natural gas that fills that gap. So, if you can do it safely, let's do a lot more. If not, then I'm with Bill on this.
And you didn't mention conversion of hot water heating to electric, but we're seeing that in places like Hawaii and some places.
I embed it just in the general idea of we need to change how we make heat. Okay, so electric water heaters are a great solution.
Yep.
Yeah, they're within that stack, let's say.
Just paging through the questions. I think we've answered most of them, and we'll continue trying to find more. Let's see. Does your increase in electric demand from electrification of vehicles take into consideration that charging at night is using electricity that is wasted today?
Ask it one more time, John.
Does your increase in electric demand from electrification of vehicles take into consideration that charging at night is using electricity that is wasted today?
That won't be the case at this scale. Okay, if you have 200 million passenger vehicles, you're not going to be wasting, excess nocturnal generation. You're going to need way more. So I haven't, it's true that there are electrical losses through conversion and through transmission. Absolutely sure. Okay, the U.S. grid has some bled out losses right now. It operates in a quasi balance around 4.1 petawatt hours. But again, if you are electrifying this many vehicles, you're going to quickly outstrip the demands of the power sector. And that's actually one of the key things that the policy makers need to watch as we electrify vehicles. What happens to local grid sources? If all of California were immediately to convert to EVs, you might not be able to get enough electricity all the time. And that could exacerbate some of the blackout issues. So there's some key balancing issues there, but I don't think that's going to be important.
This one's to Bill. Did you say that the Empire State Building removed gas lines?
No, I said that the Empire State Building did a big retrofit on all kinds of energy efficiency stuff over 2 years and managed to cut total energy use about 40%. I imagine they have gas in there for some uses remaining would be my guess, but I haven't been there to check. I've only now been vaccinated, so it won't be long before I can take the train down to New York and see you all.
Nice. How do you address equity in the transition, especially where grid infrastructure in distressed communities has been long ignored?
This is a really key question. It's why one of the reasons the Green New Deal is so important. And it's one of the things that's best about the Biden infrastructure plan, which is a key part, by the way, of getting going on the stuff that Richard's talking about. It directs about 40% of investment into the communities that have been hardest hit by the air pollution and climate effects of the fossil fuel economy. And that's really smart. I mean, it's both moral and fair. So this is why, the great job that the Sunrise Movement did in bringing forward the Green New Deal, and it's been transformational in building support.
Yeah, I'll just add to that when you drive past places like Philadelphia on 95, you see the coal plants right next to the low income areas. So getting all of these coal generation facilities shuttered will be a great thing.
Someone says very correctly in the chat that we should be putting more focus on air pollution while combating climate change at the same time. And it's a very good point. I mean, right now, the latest data indicates that about 8.7 million people around the world die each year from breathing air polluted by fossil fuel combustion. That's more than die from HIV, malaria, and tuberculosis combined. It's about 1 death in 5. In this country, African Americans have 3 times the asthma rate of white Americans, not because of physiology, because of geography. They're the ones who always have to live next to every crappy thing. So this is, and then climate change itself is the biggest engine of injustice one can imagine. the iron law of global warming is the less you did to cause it, the sooner and the harder you get hit. So it's really important to think about these things fundamentally in terms of justice. And that's why it's been so key to watch indigenous groups, frontline communities really be at the forefront of activism and of the policy planning now that's going forward.
There's a question about zero carbon liquid fuels and using those for heavy duty transportation like trucking. And the person says that those types of there are engines today that run on that type of fuel. Is that something that either of you have considered?
I want to know the chemical composition of a fuel. I believe you can put different fuels in different combustion engines. It's just what is the molecule that's in the fuel. Usually, go ahead, Bill.
I would just predict that as we develop fleets of this stuff, it's going to be so much easier to just do it with electricity. People forget, if you're running a fleet, it may turn out that the single most compelling argument for electrification of transportation for people who manage fleets is there's very few moving parts, you know, and so maintenance and things are, I mean, why put in hoses if you don't have to have hoses?
Yeah, that's right.
And then, so have you thought, Richard, about the math to pull out the cost of getting there? What do we think the cost of doing all these improvements is?
Yeah, it's easy to frame some of them and very difficult to frame others. Let me give you an example. Like, let's exclude the vehicles and then do a projection of decarbonizing US residential sector. Okay, you could estimate between $10,000 and $20,000 per retrofit. Maybe let's just take as a median 15,000. Okay, so we have 133 million households in this country. Okay, so 133 million multiplied by 15,000 is around $2 trillion. Okay, so that's a lot, right? Now you can look at the transportation sector and say, okay, well, if we have, I think it's 230 million vehicles today, and then if they're going to be electrified, how many are we going to end up with? Let's say we get some efficiency gains, modest efficiency gains, 200 million vehicles, 30,000 each. Okay, now you're looking at $6 trillion, right? So you can start, we already calculated 3 trillion for the power sector, right? So now we're already up to 11 trillion, right? So, so you can start framing this, and that there's good news and bad news. B, bad news. It's a lot, okay, but but it's not multiples of U.S. GDP. It's not multiples, and it's going to take a long time. So if it were to run at $1 trillion a year for 10 years, I'm just making this up right now, 1 out of 23 would be around 3.7% of GDP each year. Okay, so so these are financeable, achievable numbers, but yeah, it's a lot for sure.
And do you have a sense of whether the levelized cost of energy is going up in that process, and to what degree?
It's going to be dynamic. You could see the levelized cost of energy increase as there become shortages in key materials, depending on how fast you want to build. Solar panels fluctuate in cost. They don't go always down. There are periods where they've gone up, as you know, John. So we could see some fluctuation there, and it depends. But if you have a purely solar steady state grid or purely wind steady state grid, you could see the variable rate of electricity collapse once you get farther along, because your operating costs are so much larger. So I think it's dynamic. Bill, did you want to chime in?
I was just going to say, as we come near a close here, just you're thinking about the economics of this. it's always worth remembering what the cost is of not doing anything too.
Yeah, that's right.
The last numbers I saw for the high-end case for unmitigated climate change by end of the century had damages in excess of $551 trillion, which is more money than currently exists on planet Earth. So, you know, pay me now or pay me a hell of a lot more later. You know, and I mean, there's also the small problem of the world coming to an end too, but you know, in purely economic terms, that's worth bearing in mind.
That's a great point.
Well, let's wrap it up there. If you have a question that wasn't answered, feel free to email. You can just email labs@commonenergy.us or John or me directly, and we'll do our best to get back to you promptly. Bill and John, thank you so much for joining me in this discussion. It was really great to talk to you both and debate these topics. Everyone who joined on the call, thank you so much for your attention and your thoughtful questions and for participating in this. I hope it was both informative and thought-provoking. So thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.